look at any royal portrait. You see divine bloodlines, perfect genetics, rulers chosen by God himself. These people had everything: power, wealth, the best of everything life could offer. You're looking at a lie. The most powerful royal family in Europe didn't fall from grace. They destroyed themselves from the inside out. Their pure bloodline became so contaminated that their final king couldn't close his mouth, couldn't chew food, couldn't produce an heir. His own mother recoiled in horror when he was born. But before Charles II of Spain became a medical impossibility, before his jaw protruded so far he drooled constantly, before his body failed at every basic function, he was heir to the greatest empire on earth. This is one of the only documented cases in history where we can see exactly what happens when humans push genetics past the breaking point. Modern scientists who analysed his DNA found something that shouldn't be possible. He was more inbred than if his parents were siblings. What you're about to see is both tragic and terrifying. It's the story of how the most powerful dynasty in the world turned their own bodies into a biological nightmare. Let me take you back to November 6th, 1661, to a dimly lit chamber in the royal palace of Madrid. The midwives have just delivered the heir to the Spanish throne, and something is terribly wrong. The baby's head is grotesquely large, his breathing laboured. But here's what the history books don't tell you. His own mother, Queen Mariana, reportedly shuddered at the sight of him and refused to nurse her own child. This wasn't maternal cruelty. This was instinctive horror. You see, Queen Mariana wasn't just Charles's mother, she was also his cousin and his aunt. How is that possible? Because his father, Philip IV, had married his own niece. If you're trying to work out that family tree in your head right now, don't bother, it's not a tree, it's a circle. But to understand how we got to this moment, to understand how a baby could be born so genetically compromised that his own mother recoiled, we need to go back further. Way back to when the Habsburg dynasty first discovered the dark magic of keeping power in the family, literally. The Habsburgs had a saying, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." It sounds romantic until you realise they meant marrying each other. For almost 200 years, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family had been marrying cousins, uncles, wedding nieces, and in some cases double first cousins uniting in matrimony. They called it maintaining the purity of blood. Scientists now call it genetic suicide. Here's a number that will blow your mind. Over 80% of Spanish Habsburg marriages were between close relatives. Not distant cousins you might meet at a family reunion. We're talking about people who shared grandparents, or in some cases, parents. By the time Charles II was born, all 8 of his great-grandparents descended from the same couple, Philip I and Joanna of Castile, every single one. Modern genetic analysis has calculated Charles's inbreeding coefficient. That's the percentage of his genes that were identical copies from common ancestors, at 0.254. To put that in perspective, children of brother-sister incest have an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Charles II was more inbred than a child of siblings, but numbers don't capture the human cost. Let me paint you a picture of what this meant for a living, breathing child. Baby Charles couldn't suckle properly. His mouth was already showing signs of deformity. His skull bones hadn't fused properly, leaving his head misshapen and swollen. The court physicians noted he had a weak suck and struggled to feed. In an era before formula, this was life-threatening. The wet nurses hired to feed him reported something disturbing. The infant rarely cried, not because he was content, but because he seemed to lack the energy. He would lie there, pale and still, his oversized head lolling to one side, his breathing shallow and raspy. The physicians, the best in Spain, were baffled. They'd never seen an infant so fundamentally broken. As months turned to years, the true extent of Charles's condition began to reveal itself. And this is where the story gets truly disturbing. At age 4 years old, Charles still couldn't walk. Not wouldn't, couldn't. His legs were thin as sticks, bowed from rickets, unable to support even his small body weight. Servants carried him everywhere in specially designed chairs. The future king of Spain had to be carried like an infant. But wait, it gets worse. At 4 years old, Charles also couldn't speak, not a single word. His tongue, already showing signs of abnormal growth, filled his mouth. His jaw, that infamous Habsburg jaw, was already protruding. When he finally did speak his first words, sometime after his 4th birthday, they were slurred, wet, incomprehensible. The court chroniclers delicately noted that His Majesty's speech required interpretation. Let me describe what they meant by that. Charles's tongue was so enlarged that it constantly protruded from his mouth. His lower jaw jutted out so severely that his lips couldn't close. This meant that when he attempted to speak, saliva would pour from his mouth. Royal attendants stood ready with silk cloths to constantly wipe the drool from the chin of the boy who would be king. The Habsburg jaw. If you've never seen it, imagine a normal human skull, then grab the lower jaw and pull it forward several inches. Now imagine that the upper jaw didn't grow to match. The result? A mouth that can never fully close, teeth that can never meet, a tongue with nowhere to properly rest. In portraits, artists tried to minimise it, painting Charles with his mouth slightly open as if caught mid-word. In reality, his mouth was always open because it couldn't physically close. Foreign ambassadors meeting the young prince for the first time often struggled to maintain their composure. One French diplomat's private letters described the shock. The prince's appearance defies description. His jaw protrudes so far that he appears to have 2 faces, one stacked in front of the other. When he attempts to eat, food falls from his mouth. When he speaks, one must stand back to avoid the spray. And eating. God, the eating. Charles couldn't chew. Think about that for a moment. Every meal, every day for his entire life, Charles II had to swallow his food whole like a pelican. His teeth, upper and lower, were separated by such a gap that they never met. Court dining became an exercise in creative cuisine. Meats had to be cut into tiny pieces, vegetables were pureed, bread was soaked in wine until it dissolved. The English ambassador Alexander Stanhope wrote one of the most visceral descriptions. His Catholic Majesty swallows all he eats whole, for his nether jaw stands so much out that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet, to compensate which he has a prodigious stomach and swallows a whole lamb at 2 meals. But physical deformity was just the beginning. As Charles grew, or rather failed to grow properly, other problems emerged. He suffered from constant illnesses. Measles nearly killed him at age 6. Then came chickenpox, which left him covered in scars. Then rubella, then smallpox. Each disease that swept through the palace found in Charles an eager host, his compromised immune system offering little resistance. The smallpox was particularly cruel. It struck when Charles was 9, and for weeks he lay between life and death. His face, already distorted, became a battlefield of pustules and lesions. When he finally recovered, the scars joined the catalogue of his disfigurements. But the disease left something else, a complication that would haunt him forever. The physicians noticed fluid building up in his skull. His already large head began to swell further. Today we call it hydrocephalus, water on the brain. In the 17th century they called it another curse upon the prince. The pressure caused blinding headaches, vision problems, and possibly contributed to the seizures that would plague his later years. By age 10, Charles's education was a source of palace scandal. Not because he was rebellious or lazy, but because he simply couldn't learn. Tutors reported that lessons had to be repeated dozens of times. Basic mathematics was beyond him. Latin, the language of royalty and diplomacy, might as well have been ancient Egyptian. His handwriting, on the rare occasions he attempted it, looked like the scrawls of a much younger child. One tutor's private notes, discovered centuries later, paint a heartbreaking picture. His Majesty tries with great effort but retains nothing. I explain a concept, and by the next day, it is as if he has never heard it. His attention wanders. Sometimes he stares at nothing for long periods. When asked what he is thinking, he cannot say. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. As Charles entered puberty, or what should have been puberty, his body betrayed him in new ways. He grew, but barely. While other royal teenagers shot up in height, Charles remained stunted. His voice, instead of deepening, stayed high and thin. Body hair? Barely any. The characteristics that marked a boy becoming a man simply didn't happen. The court physicians were consulted. In hushed conferences, they discussed what they observed but dared not put in official records. The prince showed no interest in women. No interest in men either, for that matter. He seemed to exist in a strange, childlike state. Neither boy nor man, but something in between. This terrified the court because Charles had one job above all others, to produce an heir. The entire Spanish Empire, stretching from Europe to the Americas to the Philippines, needed the royal bloodline to continue. But how could a man who couldn't grow a proper beard father children? At age 18, they decided to find out. Charles was married to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a 17-year-old French princess who was by all accounts beautiful, intelligent, and healthy. The contrast between bride and groom shocked wedding guests. She was radiant. He was ghastly. She walked gracefully down the aisle. He shuffled, supported by attendants. When it came time for the kiss, observers noted that Marie-Louise had to steel herself visibly before leaning in. The wedding night was a disaster. Not the kind of disaster that makes for funny stories later, but the kind that determines the fate of empires. Charles, it became clear, was completely incapable of consummating the marriage. Not unwilling, incapable. His body simply didn't function as a man should. Marie-Louise, raised in the sophisticated French court, tried everything. She was patient. She was kind. She even, according to palace gossip, tried to instruct her husband in the basics of marital relations. Nothing worked. Years passed. No pregnancy. The Queen underwent humiliating examinations to determine if she was the problem. The physicians declared her perfectly fertile. The problem, everyone knew, but no one would say officially, was the king. The pressure was crushing. Both Charles and Marie-Louise were subjected to increasingly desperate fertility treatments. She was forced to drink vile concoctions of herbs and animal organs. He was made to consume potions that included ground pearls and bull's blood. At one point, the court brought in a specialist who prescribed eating the dried penis of a stag. Nothing worked, because nothing could work. Charles's reproductive system was as malformed as the rest of him. But wait, the story gets even more bizarre. Charles's mother, desperate for a grandchild to continue the Habsburg line, consulted with mystics and holy men. One suggested that Charles was cursed and that sleeping next to holy relics might break the spell. When that failed, she escalated to something that still shocks historians. She had her son sleep next to corpses. Yes, you heard that right. The Queen Mother arranged for Charles to spend nights lying beside exhumed bodies of saints and former kings, including his own father. The theory was that the holy essence of the dead would somehow cure his impotence. Picture it, the King of Spain, drooling and malformed, lying next to decomposing corpses in the hope of gaining the ability to father a child. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of failed attempts, 10 years of humiliation. Then, Marie-Louise died suddenly at age 26. The official cause was listed as appendicitis, but rumours swirled. Had she been poisoned? Had the strain of her situation driven her to suicide? We'll never know. What we do know is that Charles was genuinely devastated. Despite everything, he had grown to love his wife, perhaps the only person who had shown him real kindness. Within months, the pressure to remarry began. The council selected Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a famously fertile family. Her parents had produced 17 children. Surely the advisors reasoned such robust genes could overcome even Charles's deficiencies. They were wrong. Maria Anna, despite her healthy lineage, never became pregnant. Not once. By this time, Charles's health had deteriorated even further. Courtiers whispered that he looked like an old man though he was barely 30. His hair fell out in patches. His teeth, what few could be seen behind that protruding jaw, rotted and fell out. He shuffled when he walked, when he could walk at all. The seizures started in his 30s. Without warning, Charles would collapse, his body convulsing, foam mixing with the ever-present drool. When he recovered, he often didn't recognise the people around him. He began talking about seeing ghosts, hearing voices, feeling invisible hands touching him. The court was terrified. Was their king going mad on top of everything else? The nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, took on new meaning. People genuinely believed Charles was under a curse. The Spanish Inquisition got involved. Exorcists were brought in. At one point, the king's own confessor was arrested on charges of using witchcraft to worsen the royal condition. The trial was a sensation, though of course no amount of exorcism could cure genetic damage. Charles himself believed he was cursed. In lucid moments, he would weep and ask what he had done to deserve such punishment. He wore amulets, carried holy relics, and submitted to increasingly bizarre purification rituals. Nothing helped, because nothing could help. His genetic code was his curse, written into every cell of his body. By age 35, Charles looked ancient. Contemporary descriptions are hard to read. His skin hung loose on his skeletal frame. His famous jaw seemed to grow even more pronounced as the rest of his face wasted away. He was completely bald, his scalp covered in sores. He could barely walk, shuffling a few steps before needing to rest. His speech, always difficult, became nearly impossible to understand. But the worst was yet to come. In his final years, Charles began to mentally deteriorate rapidly. He would sit for hours, staring at nothing, drool pooling on his clothes. When spoken to, he often didn't respond. When he did speak, he rambled about demons and angels, about his dead wife, about children he would never have. The king of one of the world's greatest empires had become a hollow shell. The end came in 1700. Charles was 38 years old, not elderly by any standard, but his body was shutting down. He couldn't eat even his specially prepared mush. He couldn't stand without help. He spent his days propped up in bed, gasping for breath, his hydrocephalic head causing unbearable pressure. On November 1st, after days of agony, Charles II died. What happened next would shock even the physicians who had treated him for years. The autopsy. Oh God, the autopsy. If you thought the living Charles was a medical horror show, his corpse was something out of a nightmare. The royal physicians tasked with embalming their king cut open the body and recoiled. Their report, written in clinical Latin but dripping with barely concealed horror, described a body that shouldn't have been able to sustain life as long as it did. His body did not contain a single drop of blood. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. Charles's circulatory system had essentially shut down, his blood either clotted or simply absent. His heart, and this is where it gets truly grotesque, his heart was described as the size of a peppercorn. Not literally that small, but shriveled, blackened, barely recognisable as the organ that should pump life through a body. His lungs were corroded, their word for what we might now recognise as massive scarring from repeated infections. Imagine lung tissue that looked more like pumice stone than organs meant for breathing. His intestines were described as rotten and gangrenous. Parts of his digestive system had literally died while he was still alive, explaining the horrific pain he endured in his final years. But the most telling detail, the one that confirmed what everyone suspected but no one had dared say officially, Charles had only one testicle, and it was black as coal. This single, atrophied, dead piece of tissue was all that remained of what should have been a functioning reproductive system. No wonder he couldn't father children. It's a miracle he survived puberty at all. And his brain, remember that oversized fluid-filled head? The physicians found it was indeed full of water. The hydrocephalus had left barely any room for actual brain tissue. How Charles had managed to function at all, how he had managed to speak and think and rule, however poorly, was a medical mystery. The physicians who performed this autopsy must have stood there, covered in the gore of their dissection, and marvelled that this collection of malformed organs had somehow sustained life for nearly 4 decades. Every system was compromised, every organ was damaged. It was as if Charles's body had been at war with itself from the moment of conception. Modern genetic analysis has given us the why behind this horror show. Remember that inbreeding coefficient of 0.254? That means a quarter of Charles's genome consisted of identical copies of genes. In those repeated sequences lurk the instructions for his destruction. Scientists now believe Charles suffered from at least 2 major genetic disorders. The first was combined pituitary hormone deficiency. His body couldn't produce the hormones needed for normal growth and development. This explained his short stature, his inability to sexually mature, his muscle weakness, his cognitive problems. His pituitary gland, the master controller of the endocrine system, was essentially non-functional. The second was likely distal renal tubular acidosis. His kidneys couldn't properly regulate his blood chemistry. This caused the rickets that bent his legs, the muscle weakness that left him unable to walk and possibly contributed to the hydrocephalus that swelled his skull. Either condition alone would have been challenging. Together they created a cascade of failures throughout his body. Add in the Habsburg jaw, itself a genetic condition called mandibular prognathism, and you had a perfect storm of genetic disasters. Some researchers have proposed an even rarer possibility, a lysosomal storage disease called aspartyl glucosamminuria. Patients with this condition develop normally for their first few years, then begin showing delays. By adulthood, they have coarse facial features, intellectual disability, and shortened lifespans. The match with Charles's symptoms is eerily exact. But here's the truly horrifying part. Charles wasn't uniquely unlucky. He was the inevitable result of systematic inbreeding. Of the 34 children born to Spanish Habsburg monarchs, more than half died before age 10. The dynasty was literally breeding itself to death, and Charles was simply the final, most extreme example. When Charles died without an heir, it triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would reshape Europe. The Spanish Empire, built over centuries, shattered because one man's body was too broken to produce a single child. The Habsburg line that had ruled Spain for nearly 200 years ended not with the assassination or a revolution, but with a king so inbred his own flesh betrayed him. The Bourbon dynasty that replaced the Habsburgs learned the lesson. While royal marriages remained political, the extreme inbreeding that created Charles II was never repeated. The nightmare of the Habsburg jaw, the horror of Charles's autopsy, the tragedy of a king who couldn't chew his own food, these became cautionary tales whispered in royal courts across Europe. Charles II remains in medical textbooks as the ultimate example of genetic collapse. Students studying genetics see his portrait and learn about inbreeding coefficients. His Habsburg jaw has become shorthand for the dangers of closed gene pools. In a strange way, his suffering contributed to our understanding of heredity and the importance of genetic diversity. But beyond the medical curiosity, beyond the political consequences, there was a human being. Charles II lived every day in a body that was failing him. He endured constant pain, humiliation, and the knowledge that he was failing in his most basic duty as king. He was mocked as the bewitched, when his only curse was his ancestry. In his final letter, dictated because he could no longer hold a pen, Charles wrote about hoping to find peace in death that had eluded him in life. For a man who had endured 4 decades of physical and mental anguish, who had been propped up on the throne like a grotesque puppet, death must have seemed like mercy. The portrait I mentioned at the beginning? It hangs now in the Museo del Prado in Madrid. Visitors pause before it, struck by the obvious deformities even the court painter couldn't fully hide. But now you know the truth behind that image. You know about the jaw that couldn't close, the tongue that couldn't fit, the body that couldn't function, the genome that had turned against itself. Charles II of Spain wasn't cursed by witches or demons. He was cursed by his own family tree, a tree so tangled it had become a noose. His story stands as perhaps history's starkest warning about the dangers of genetic isolation. In trying to keep power in the family, the Habsburgs destroyed their own bloodline. The next time you see a royal portrait, remember Charles II. Remember that behind the crowns and sceptres and royal grandeur, biology always has the final say. And sometimes, that final say is horrifying beyond imagination. If this story shocked you, hit that like button, because the algorithm, unlike royal bloodlines, rewards spreading the wealth. Drop a comment with your thoughts on which historical figure's hidden story you'd like me to uncover next. Subscribe for more suppressed historical truths that your textbooks definitely didn't cover. And remember, every time you share genetic diversity, somewhere a Habsburg ghost breathes a sigh of relief.